Hello.
Hello.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Not bad.
Good.
I am just gonna pull up the questions for the Q&A. And we'll wait also for a few more people to hopefully trickle in.
Okay.
The good thing is, either way, we've got this session going, we're recording it, and we're gonna have a summary out on the blog. So many useful ways in which our users can benefit from this session.
Awesome.
Hey, Doug.
Hi.
Hey, Adriana.
Nice to meet you.
I'm just realizing how crazy my hair looks, so I'm probably gonna turn my video off in a second.
You should just do what I do and pluck.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm kidding.
like,
Don't do that.
I want to be prepared, but yeah. Should probably switch my angle, but oh well.
So Ted said he won't be able to join.
Sorry, what did you say?
Ted said he won't be able to join.
Okay.
But it's all good. Reese, do you want to wait till like 5 after before we start, or give it a couple more minutes?
We can probably get started. I imagine, if people do pop on, they can probably catch up, hopefully.
Cool. That sounds good. All right. Well, in that case, we shall get started. So welcome to our, I guess, second Q&A of the year. And this time we have Doug Ramirez from Uplight, who has enthusiastically volunteered to share his experiences in adopting OpenTelemetry at Uplight. So welcome, Doug.
Hi. Thank you, Adrian. I'm really glad to be here. And I think as you and I were talking the other day, I was trying to describe what it is about observability that I like so much. And hey, Vagif. And the way I was describing it to Adriana is that, I think for a lot of people, the reason we got into computer programming, computer software, whatever we want to call it, is that that kind of immediate sense of gratification that you got when you started writing your first few lines of code. Like you wrote some code, and depending on how young or old you are, you might have compiled it and linked it and executed it, or you just might have run it in some kind of interpreter. But that initial feedback that you get where you're like, ooh, I made something happen. And so for me, like as a kid, when I started writing software in the 70s, like for me, observability is really kind of about scratching that itch and that idea of like, I want to see the thing that I'm building, executing in some kind of runtime environment. I want to get feedback. And so for me, observability speaks a lot to that kind of initial excitement that I remember having, and was one of the things that really got me excited about computers and software and computer programming. And as I've talked to people over the decades, I think that's a familiar story for a lot of people, just the idea of like, ooh, I did something that was really cool. And so for me, observability in a lot of ways is about like that childlike excitement that you got when you wrote your first program and actually got to see it run for the first time.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. And yeah, with observability, it's like, oh my God, I know what it's doing now.
Yeah. And and again, like, it's, today, right, wrong, or indifferent, right? And in cloud computing and the way that we do things today, it's interesting how it's actually kind of gotten hard to see your software running. And so, like, more than ever, I think observability is important, for technical reasons and business reasons, but I think also just for developers to be able to kind of have that same sense of excitement that you had when you first wrote your first program, but get it every day, all day as a professional.
Yeah, most definitely. And with that, I think it's a good segue for us to launch into our questions. So first things first, would you tell us a little bit about your role at Uplight?
Okay, sure. So my title is principal architect. I work specifically on the part of our engineering group around our platform. Uplight's a very interesting company. If you can go to uplight.com. Our mission is to save the planet. And we do that by helping utilities operate their grids as efficiently as possible so that, we can minimize resource consumption really at the end of the day and offset CO2. And so a lot, without going into a whole lot of detail about what Uplight, how those platforms actually work, but we have some central platforms where we centralize a lot of our large data sets around utilities. And so as we've grown through mergers and acquisitions, the data platform, the utility data platform, the Uplight data platform is a very important component that enables a lot of our applications and the things that ultimately deliver value to our customers. And so my role as principal architect on the platform is to help, essentially design and architect that in ways that, satisfies the things that the business needs it to do. But more importantly, or as importantly, is something that gives our developers a lot of ease in which to leverage that platform. And observability is a big part of that. And so, my role as principal architect in thinking about building out this platform, extending this platform, observability is one of the most important things that we optimize for as an architecture characteristic. And so I have spent a lot of time in the last year thinking about observability, talking about observability, trying to bake observability into everything that we do. So that's my role at Uplight.
Cool. And so, like you mentioned, wanting, like, making sure that observability is baked into the organization. Given that, you've prioritized observability, which I think we're all excited about, how does it factor in terms of, like, some of the challenges that you have experienced at Uplight, insofar as, like, what do you think observability will help to solve?
So I think for us, and given sort of where the different levels of maturity are with different aspects of our software ecosystem, like there's, so there are places where observability is well dialed in and it's going very well. There's other places where it's not going so well. And we're, we're a company that is actually a conglomerate, or we're made up of several other companies that were brought together as part of the Uplight brand.
Mm-hmm.
So as you can imagine, a couple of different companies all coming together. There's different technology stacks. There's different design patterns that were implemented. There were different ways essentially to approach the same problem. So one of the things that our platform does, and one of the things that I'm trying to help enable in all the other applications and services that use our platform, is to have a common path to creating observability. And so specifically, as it relates to observability within Uplight, I think one of the problems I'm working to solve is to try to create a single path for giving developers the ability to see their code executing in a runtime environment. And for us, that means really leaning into OpenTelemetry as a standard, a specification, and a set of tools to get there. So again, kind of zooming out, the idea is, okay, we've got all these different systems. They're built with different stacks. We need to observe them all running together as a cohesive unit. How can we do that? And what we landed on as a solution last year was let's adopt OpenTelemetry. Let's really lean into the specification and this API. And if we do this well, we can create the same experience that every developer in the company has when it comes to observing their code, irrespective of the tech stack that they're using. I think that's one of the design goals that OpenTelemetry has, and I feel like that is actually going to enable us and has been enabling us to achieve the things that we want to achieve, specifically as it relates to that developer experience.
Yeah, fair. Now, what about like the architecture that you guys are working with? You did mention that there was like some disparate systems.
Yeah.
What does the landscape look like?
I kind of joke, but it's kind of true. Like when people ask me, like, well, what do you use at Uplight? And I'm like, everything. we use everything. We in some ways we do. We have a lot of, we have a lot of Ruby applications, we have a lot of Java applications, we have a lot of Python applications. I'm sure there's some .NET stuff floating around. So it's hard to describe like the tech stack. I think that we are trying, we kind of have a standard internally that says like, hey, any new development, we want to leverage Python, especially as it relates to our microservices. We rely heavily on Fast API as a framework for doing things and building things. But we have a lot of legacy code and we have monoliths, which can be great. So what that meant for us is, okay, well, how do we get observability and how do we get OpenTelemetry injected or baked into all these different platforms, given the fact that some of them are old, some of them are new, some of them use different languages, some of them use different frameworks. And so the way that we decided to kind of increment our way to really using OpenTelemetry and really creating a really solid observability experience is to start with structured logging. So for us, that meant, okay, let's go and wrangle in all of our different apps and services in our platforms. And let's start by standardizing on structured logging with OpenTelemetry. And what that does is that it does a couple things. One is it gives developers like the most basic thing they need. Like most developers want to be able to just write a log record so I can see what's happening.
Yeah.
So in my mind, like if I think about like levels of maturity as it relates to observability, and we think about the 3 pillars of observability, like logs, metrics, and traces. In my experience, it's generally been easy to get developers to adopt something if they can get that feedback, right? Like I can log a record, I can log a message, and I can see it land someplace. So what it meant was, how can we go about, getting people to understand OpenTelemetry, understand what the long-term vision around observability is, but begin with structured logging and start to get the SDKs into our applications and our services and our repos. So the plan has been, while we have this aspirational vision for observability, right now, what we really want to do is we want to get the OpenTelemetry SDKs for whatever the language is into the repo, being leveraged, part of the build pipelines, et cetera, so that once we get that in place and we start to give the developers the observability we like to have around structured logging, 1 line of code, 2 lines of code, and all of a sudden I'm emitting metrics and I haven't really had to do anything else. Another line of code, another 2 lines of code, and now I'm actually creating traces. And I'm able to do that because I already have the software development kits baked into my application, right? I've kind of gotten over that big hurdle of like, what's OpenTelemetry? What is this SDK? How do I instantiate this so I can just say logger.info? Once we've gotten over that hump, the path to really then leaning into those other pillars of observability become really easy because all of that scaffolding is already done. It's kind of part of my pipeline. I've got it in my packages, I'm running it locally, etc. So that for us, or at least for me, as I think about observability and kind of where Uplight is, it seemed like a nice way to kind of increment our way to, what we really ultimately want to get by simply solving the problem of let's get structured logging done. Let's get the SDKs baked into the repos. Let's get people used to it. Let's get comfortable with how we're going to receive, process, and export the signal to whatever the APM is. And once we do that, then we're kind of off and running.
Cool. And now taking just a bit of a step back and going back to like your understanding your tech stack. Can you describe like what your build process is like, for example?
It depends. Favorite thing that we say in engineering, right? It depends.
Yeah. I guess build and deployment actually, which I'm sure also depends, right?
Yeah, it does. Boy, I don't think it's anything terribly unique. I think we leverage Circle CI a lot, and Jenkins in certain areas. So I think the deployment process is pretty familiar. We run everything in containers. We use all the cloud providers, and so I think so it depends on the business that you're in, and it varies. We're working on trying to normalize and unify all this around a single set of tools that allow us to deploy to whichever cloud provider we want to use. The good news is that as it relates to observability, that from what we've seen so far, like using OpenTelemetry and using the SDKs that we have, it hasn't impacted or really kind of informed the pipelines in a way that makes us do anything weird or wonky. Like from our perspective, it's just importing it and using a different library. There are some things that we've had to consider specifically around using the OpenTelemetry collector. Like, do we deploy a single OpenTelemetry collector alongside an application where it's already running, let's say in AWS or GCP, or do we start to build out some kind of infrastructure so that when an application lands someplace, there's an endpoint where there's an OpenTelemetry collector listening, and perhaps a bunch of them behind like a load balancer or something like that. So, today, at least, we've been able to kind of achieve that goal of like, let's get the SDKs injected into our repos. Let's get people using structured logging. And it hasn't, fortunately, it hasn't had to change or impact any of the tooling around our pipelines.
Now, how has it been in terms of getting that buy-in on folks using those SDKs and getting them using the structured logging? Can you talk about that?
So it was interesting, the conversations around this. A lot of the conversations that we had, again, because my approach was, let's start with logging. So we talked a lot about just structured logging, and where we ended, obviously we ended up with, deciding to really lean into the log signal, even though it's still new. But one of the things we realized was, somebody solved this problem, like structuring a log record. Like, there's a bunch of different ways you can do it, but essentially you're looking at creating attributes around a log message that essentially are the same. What time did this happen? Like, what should we call that? We could debate all day long about what we want to label these things, but we realized that, OpenTelemetry and all the people that have contributed to this have already solved the problem. They've already thought about these things. From our perspective, structured logging doesn't really differentiate us in the marketplace. It really is kind of a means to an end. So we had lots of internal debates, like, well, how should we structure the log? What should we do? Does OpenTelemetry really give us what we need? Do we need to extend what OpenTelemetry has given us? But at the end of the day, it was like, well, this is actually really good and it satisfies everything we need. Let's just adopt this specification and not reinvent the wheel. And if we do that, then we have that path to the other pillars of observability. And then we can see a clear path to what we really want to get around observability. And so, if you fast forward from those conversations to then the conversations around metrics and traces, the conversations kind of started to sound the same, but a little bit quicker. Like, do we really want to create something new? I don't think we're doing anything terribly unique or different.
Yeah.
The standard and the specification already exist. There's a bunch of other smart people working on this already. Let's just ride the coattails of their R&D efforts. And that way we can get to our goal of observability much quicker.
Yeah, so you're basically like using the logs as the, hey, look, let's not reinvent the wheel. Oh, by the way, we don't have to reinvent the wheel with traces and metrics too. Yay.
Yes, busted.
Nice,
Exactly.
nice. I like the
Yeah.
strategy. So
Yeah.
I'm quite curious because like logs are probably like one of the newest specifications
Mhm.
out
Yeah, I
there.
know.
So I've not spoken with anyone thus far who has actually guinea pigged the logs. So yeah, like what can you talk a little bit about how that's been, given that it's so new out there?
So, there definitely was a lot of concerns raised about the maturity of the log specification and the tooling around it. And I will admit that it definitely gave me pause as well. I think where we became comfortable with it was when we started to peek ahead a little bit and started to really kind of test out log correlation. I think at least in my experience, and I could be wrong about this, but my observation was that when people started to people became comfortable, I think, with the newness of the log signal when they saw logs being correlated to traces.
Mhm.
And at that point, I think people were like, oh, okay, this works. I get log correlation, which is what I really want to get to, right?
Yeah.
And so I think once people were able to see the new spec for logs working very well with traces, I think that kind of let everybody relax into the idea of that this isn't as risky as we think it's going to be. And the worst case scenario is, the worst case scenario is we go and we build something ourselves, but that's probably not going to happen. Like the question came up, sorry, I'm not explaining this well. The question came up several times, like, well, what happens if OpenTelemetry goes away? Like it gets deleted. It's like, okay, well, we're no worse off than we are today, which is essentially being our own worst vendor. Which was one of our goals, is like we didn't want to be our own worst vendor for something that is, I don't want to say just purely tactical, but it's kind of tactical. Like it doesn't really differentiate us in the market. It enables us to be a different differentiator. So anyway, I think when people saw log correlation happening, I think it kind of allowed people to relax into the idea and feel really good about where we were going. I don't know if I answered your question or not, Adriana.
I think you did. I think you did.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and honestly, I think log correlation is probably the thing that helps tie all the, like, having these correlations is really the magic, right, that we start seeing with observability. Like the logs tell the stories around your traces. The traces are the end to end, but the logs tell you what's happening at this point in time. So having that correlation is definitely key. Now I do want to circle back. You did mention, like, you alluded to some challenges in terms of getting folks to adopt OpenTelemetry. What are some of the challenges in general that you've experienced? And you mentioned, like, some of the strategies that you implemented to get people more comfortable. If you can expand on that.
So I think one of the big challenges we had was one of the big challenges we had was essentially deviating away from what our APM vendor was giving us. So, initially, I think like a lot of companies, we all feel like we're spending a lot of money on our APM vendors. So we're very sensitive to that relationship. And because of that, I think there was definitely some people within the company who saw the vendor giving us a solution and thought like, well, why don't we just use the vendor solution? And so again, it's that kind of that typical debate or very traditional debate that we have internally. It's like, how do we defend against, vendor lock-in, but still kind of do what we need to do? And so we spent some time thinking about this. I think at the end of the day, after we saw the structured logging working, we saw the trace log correlation working, we saw metrics working. We're at the point now where we're beginning to see the benefit of using context propagation to see spans and traces that interact across different processes. I think we started to realize that we actually have a way to defend against vendor lock-in, and the risk seems minimal. So I think one of the big challenges we had was just trying to make that distinction. Like, do we go with what the vendor's giving us, use their SDKs, know that we're being locked in, but have a path? Or do we spend the time to step back and say, okay, can we provide a unified experience for all the developers, regardless of the stack, regardless of the language, and it ultimately just kind of give the developer what they want. And what I think that means is I want to write one line of code to emit a log record. And wherever it lands, I'm hoping that there's a tooling around that so that I can observe my code. But as a developer, I'm far more interested in having a path to getting to observability, making it easy in my day-to-day coding, and not have to have the vendor's stuff leak into what I'm thinking about on a day-to-day basis. So I think once developers were able to kind of see, oh, I can achieve all the things that I want, and I can help the business by defending against this vendor lock-in, and I'm learning a skill that's very portable. And most people I'm talking to these days about observability are talking about OpenTelemetry anyway. This is going to end up being a really wonderful thing. So let's go down this path.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's such a good position to be in. I mean, I'm biased because I'm a huge fan of OpenTelemetry, but like OpenTelemetry is in a really good place right now because I think there's so much that has been hashed out and there's so much buy-in from like all the major vendors that it's kind of hard to like, justify using like vendor SDKs for your telemetry when there's this nice little standard that everyone's supporting over here.
Yeah. I think that the other thing that was interesting about our internal debates and conversations were really kind of around this idea of, is OpenTelemetry mature?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I found myself doing a lot of was kind of, like unwinding the history of OpenTelemetry and then letting people know that like, this isn't something that's half-baked that just came about last year. Like this is actually, years of thinking and designing and coming up with the specification. Like there's some maturity behind this that if you start to really kind of understand the history of OpenTelemetry, I think it started to make people feel a little bit better that we weren't on the bleeding edge per se. And that, some big companies and some very smart people have been thinking about this for a while. And, this concept of like, or this kind of litmus test, like are other titans of the industry bought into this thing? Because then I'll feel comfortable using it.
Yeah.
And so I feel like a lot of what I was doing internally while trying to sell this idea was saying things like, hey, let's go look at the APM vendors out there and let's go look at their blog posts. What do you know? They're all talking about OpenTelemetry. These projects came from, the OpenTelemetry project came from other projects. And every now and then you would say to people something like OpenCensus or OpenTrace, and like, oh, I've heard of that. I'm like, hey, that's what this is. Like, relax. So I think understanding the maturity of OpenTelemetry and understanding the history of it, I think helped a lot with, selling it internally and getting people to buy into it, the idea of it. Not only, amongst engineers, but also within our leadership. Because not everybody in our engineering leadership was as familiar as with some of these things as I am. And so I think being able to explain the history and being able to show them like, hey, there's books written about this. Look at the blog posts from all the APM vendors. Look at what Google's doing. Look at what, the other open source projects are starting to like kind of shed some things and starting to say like, we don't need to do that anymore because now OpenTelemetry is doing this.
Yeah.
I think me being in a position to kind of go and do that research and kind of bring it back to Uplight and then share it internally, I think that helped a lot with the adoption.
That's awesome. So how did you go about sharing internally? Like, did you do like a big like OpenTelemetry tour blitz? Or yeah, what was the process?
I think it was a lot of little things. Just me evangelizing things, either in internal conversations, like when I have a position to talk to the whole company about what we're doing within architecture. I people have heard me talk a lot about, but this idea of like at Uplight, like the three major architecture concerns that we're optimizing for right now are observability, deployability, and security. Not at the expense of anything else, but like we're kind of sequencing our work a little bit and putting more time and attention into observability, deployability, and security. So as I've been talking about these overarching architecture concerns, I've been using those opportunities to talk about OpenTelemetry and show people how it all works. We rely on, or are going to continue to rely even more on using Loom as a way to capture short videos that we can share internally. I don't know if how many people remember Channel 9 at Microsoft, but Channel 9 was this thing that Microsoft did where they started to record videos to disseminate information internally very quickly. So the idea was like you tune into Channel 9 and you can see these videos of what everybody else is doing at the company. I'm pretty sure I got that right. You can go to Wikipedia and double check my math there. But so we're trying to kind of create that same mechanism to share information really quickly. Like when people say something, it's like, great, go record a Loom 5 minutes or less, talk about something, show some code, and just do that quickly and share information. So I've recorded a bunch of Looms on, structured logging, metrics, traces. I've just been starting to do some videos around distributed tracing and integrating with some webhook platforms. So that's been another way to do it. We also at Uplight, we do hackathons. So we have internal hackathons, which are awesome. So awesome. Everyone should do it. And so during our hackathons, I've been able to make sure that OpenTelemetry gets used quite a bit.
Nice. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And how have the responses been towards the Loom videos?
Really positive. I think there definitely are people who like long format writing and reading. I'm not one of those people. I don't like to write. I don't like to write text. I'd rather just code something and show it to you. And so like video is just a great way for me as an author to explain things. And I also just like I like consuming things quickly in short bites, asynchronously. And I just love video. I think you can explain so much more in a video. So I think if you look at our Loom stats, you'll notice over the last year, there's been quite a big spike as more and more people are starting to lean into that medium to explain things and share information quickly.
That is very cool. That's the first time I've heard of folks using Loom internally for that. So that's that kudos to you guys for
Yeah.
for getting the enthusiasm up around that. Cool. Now one thing that I wanted to ask around like implementation of OpenTelemetry, you said that you started using the OpenTelemetry SDKs. How has the overall experience been around integrating that into the application code? I know you and I talked about Python. So maybe you could start with Python. And
Yeah.
if there are other languages as well, we'd love to hear your thoughts around that.
It's been interesting. It's put a lens on some of the idiosyncrasies that a lot of software engineers have. This is a debate that I guess I've been dealing with for probably 35 years now, but this idea of like, does a shared library help? So for us, we spent a fair amount of time trying to think about the developer experience and the benefits of a shared library. So for example, when so at Uplight, when we make architecture decisions, there's always a few artifacts and outcomes that we produce. We produce an internal RFC, so or a DAISY. So we capture our decision in some kind of documentation. We produce a hypothesis for a fitness function. So like, how do we test our architecture to assert that it is satisfying some kind of characteristic that we have? And then we produce a reference architecture or a reference implementation. When I first started showing off some of the reference implementations, like, we had the code that kind of instantiated the logger, the meter, and the tracer for OpenTelemetry just in a common module, common.py. And so, of course, when developers see that, they're like, oh, should we tease that out and put that into a library that other people import? And so then we have this debate of, okay, like, well, it's like 7 lines, 8 lines of code, 9 lines of code. Like, do we put that into a library, or do we just let people copy and paste it, or do we let them go on their own? Because at the end of the day, the SDK is there. And like, what effort do we spend to reduce that to something that's even smaller, even fewer lines of code? So, we spent a lot of time trying to think about, like, how do we make it easy for people to adopt this? Do we come up with an Uplight library that people can import, and then with 1 line of code they can instantiate a logger? Do we let them self-serve? Do we let them pull from a common module? I don't know if we've really landed on a popular path, but I think right now the answer is, well, let's just let everybody kind of self-serve. Like, if you want to create like, there's a group of people that have created an Uplight library that kind of sits on top of the SDK. We'll see how that goes. We have people that are just writing, directly to the SDK. I think there's people that have probably gone back to my reference architecture and copied that common module and brought it into their applications, maybe fucks with it a little bit. But yes, I think if you zoom out, the good news is that it's really easy to adopt it. And that depending on your organization, you could benefit from a shared library or not, or some code that you can copy and paste. But again, the good news is that all the heavy lifting has been taken care of, and that you can start with OpenTelemetry and the SDKs today. And that would be my recommendation, is like, start using it today, like any other package or any other language that you're dealing with. And over time, if you see opportunities to refactor things and put them into a package and make it so that developers really can use that package seamlessly, and that package is going to be maintained, and it's going to use, the new versions of the SDKs that are coming out and not get old and crusty and blah, 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 then by all means go do that too. But I think looking back, I would have suggested, hey, let's not even worry about having this conversation right now. Like, we're overthinking it. Let's just get started.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as far as like the instrumentation goes, you guys are using, like, is it a combination of auto instrumentation and manual instrumentation, or do you prefer one over the other? What's been your experience?
I think I've seen a little bit of both. I definitely have seen some. I've seen some code where the auto instrumentation for fast API is being used, and I think a lot of it is manual. I think where I'm thinking right now is as we move past structured logging and get into tracing, the idea of doing it manually, meaning within like a code block, let's say for an API endpoint, Do I instantiate a trace there? Or do I use a decorator and something else that's part of a framework to do some of that work for me? I think kind of going back to what I said before, I think my advice to everybody would be like to try one of the, maybe try manual first, like try it manually first, like start your tracer, like within a width block, let's say, and just see how it goes. And if you start to see the benefit there, then start to extract that out into a decorator, let's say, or some middleware maybe that works well with your framework. But again, the good news is that the SDKs give you everything you need. How much you decide to optimize on top of that, I think is up to you and whatever use case you're solving. My advice would be do the minimal to get it plugged into your code, do the minimal to get traces being emitted and your logs emitted and correlated, and then go back and do that refactoring later. I mean, we've all seen this, right? Like you sit down as a developer, you're like, ooh, like how can I reduce this to like the ultimate thing? And sometimes you get value out of those exercises and sometimes you don't.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Cool. One thing that I wanted to circle back on was you talked briefly about your OTel collector deployment.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's always a very interesting hot topic among us because it's always interesting to see how folks choose to deploy their collectors. So I think you mentioned earlier about like tinkering with a couple of different ways to deploy your collectors.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. So I think like a lot of companies that are in the cloud these days, and with some of the best practices that we see around how to organize people around software. And I'm thinking about things like team topologies, full service ownership. Like we have these new ways of thinking about how people work and support their code because we have the cloud and these virtual data centers and all the things, right? So we've been spending a lot of time really kind of thinking about like how can we enable FSO? How can we lean into some of the things that we think are really valuable as it relates to team topologies, but at the same time not have to have every team have like a mini ops group inside of it or a mini infrastructure group inside of it. And like a lot of companies, our infrastructure people are really tapped out. And the demands on our infrastructure people will outpace their availability for the next several years. And so trying to find a balance between, what I would ultimately like, which is just an endpoint that I hit that's up, has a greater availability to my application. I know that I can just send things to it, meaning the OpenTelemetry collector, and it's just going to handle stuff, versus, letting people get started today. Maybe they run the OpenTelemetry collector as kind of a sidecar in their deployment, and they just hit that, and then later on they can point to something else. I don't know if we have enough experience yet where I feel like I could tell people like what a really good way to approach it would be. I think if I could give anybody advice, I would say just start using it. Like it's the good news about the collector is that it's already packaged up for you. If you're familiar with running a container, which most of us are these days, you can get started with OpenTelemetry. And what's also really nice about it is that like as a developer, I can run it locally. Like I'm doing a lot of stuff with Docker or Rancher anyway. So like if I've got this little thing running over here and I'm just shooting stuff towards it, then I'm able to develop. I can offload that cognitive load. I can think about the one line of code I want to write to emit a log record, and know that when I deploy it, I'm probably going to have a sidecar nearby, which is going to get sent to. Maybe there's a centralized collector that's running someplace. or maybe even better, there's just an endpoint with a bunch of collectors running behind it, scaling out however they need to scale. Long way of saying, I don't know yet. I don't know yet what
do you have a central collector like right now in place? Like it sounds like you've got
so
bunch of
we and
different configurations.
yeah, so like some of our larger Kubernetes clusters, like those platforms, like there's a collector running inside of it. So like if you deploy to it, you'll know that it's there, or you can rely on the fact that it's there. But again, like the we still have a lot of code running outside of GKE or the equivalent at AWS, and so those applications and services need a path, and so they're deploying collectors close to them. So a little bit of both. Like we have it running standalone as some sidecars. We have it running in a few central locations. I ultimately would like for any deployment at any cloud provider just to know that there's going to be an endpoint with some kind of name and listening on a port. And regardless of where I deploy my code, and irrespective of the cloud provider, I can rely on the fact that that thing's going to be there and it's going to handle the receiving, processing, and exporting of those signals.
Cool. And who typically maintains the collectors? Is that like your infrastructure team?
Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
And unless unless like a team has decided in the spirit of full service ownership to run it themselves, which we give developers agency to do that.
Is that something that teams are enthusiastic about? Those who do they regret it once they ask for ownership?
So I think we're still kind of, I don't know if we have enough history yet. I think like ask me in a year after their collectors might have died or gone offline or something at some point, then maybe we'll have a different perspective on it. But right now, I think people are happy to have the agency to run the collectors locally because it's super easy. Most people, most developers these days, certainly at Uplight, like I think we're all okay with Terraform, and we can do some stuff with Docker. We know how to wire this stuff up and ultimately get it provisioned someplace. Whether it's arguable whether or not that's really the best use of a developer's time, but right now I think it's giving people a path to success. So we can go with that and refactor later.
Awesome. I know we've got like 11-ish minutes left on the clock. I would love to get your feedback as we wrap up on like your experiences with the OpenTelemetry project. Because, like we love hearing the positive user stories of OpenTelemetry, but we also want to hear candid feedback on like, where are things rough around the edges? What can we do to improve it so that we can bring that feedback to the respective SIGs and get them actioned?
I can share a couple things, a couple thoughts. One is I've been very happy with the activity on the Slack org. It's been nice to chat with people there. It's been nice to just kind of lurk and watch the conversations. So like anybody that I talk to about observability or OpenTelemetry, one of the first things I say is like, go get on the Slack org and just watch and just go to the collector channel, go to the logs channel, go to the Python channel, and go in there every now and then and just kind of see what people are talking about. So that's awesome. Like, thank you all for doing that. Really appreciate the visibility into like what's happening and being able to lurk and just watch the conversation, because it definitely has informed my thinking and the decisions that I've been making at Uplight, being able to watch to see what's happening and kind of like understand where things are going and to also to understand what to avoid. I've definitely gotten some really good feedback from the Slack channel where people have said like, hey, Doug, I know what question you're asking. I know where you're going with this, but you really don't want to go down that path for these reasons. And it's been like, man, that's what a lifesaver. Like I was able to avoid making a mistake because someone was able to kind of give me a gentle nudge in a different direction. I've contributed a little bit to the open source project, the Python SDK. I will say that it took me a little bit of time to understand, like, how do I really get engaged, and like, who do I speak to in the Slack channel, and like, how do I stick my neck out and say, like, hey, I opened a PR, and like, can somebody please look at it, and like, I hate to bother you, please be nice. So I think anything that could be done to like let people know that, and not to say that like my stuff wasn't accepted with open arms, but anything that we can do to make it super easy and super obvious for people to contribute, I think that would be helpful. One area where, and I can understand why this is a challenge, but one area where I think a lot of open source projects kind of deal with this is like, where do we have the conversations? Do we have the conversation in GitHub issues? Do we have the conversation in Slack? Like, what's appropriate to go where? I don't want to be duplicative, but I also want to have the conversation in the right place. And so I don't know if there's good guidance or good practices that help people understand, like, where do I raise my hand as maybe somebody who's new and wants to contribute, or somebody who's new and is seeing a problem. So that's an area that I think that that could help with some clarification. And again, I think that's true for a lot of open source projects. Like, how do I get involved? Where do I have the conversations?
Yeah, that's a really, really fair point. And I think we're still trying to sort that out ourselves. But also, like, we are open to any suggestions.
Yeah. Okay, good. I like I said, I appreciate the challenges of, having the conversation span, the code repos and Slack. Sorry. Down. Yeah, like, if I can think of a way to do that, I will certainly let you know, let you all know. I had, the other thought I had was, maybe more and increasingly simple reference implementations.
Hmm.
And I don't know specifically what that would look like, but if I think about some of the questions I see being asked in the Slack channel, there are often people who are just getting started and they're like, hey, I looked at this bit of code, I have the collector running locally, nothing's showing up.
Mhm.
And I think we've all been there before. We all managed to kind of hack our way through it, and now we're kind of past that, and so we don't think about that anymore. But I often wonder if those people who are like, I just did hello world in Ruby, I got this collector running, I don't see any traffic. And also, for some people who are new to languages or OpenTelemetry or observability in general, they're not going to be Docker wizards. And I know, like, for me, I still get hung up around Docker networking. I'm like, is this thing listening? Like, what's it doing? So, like, anything that I think we could do to say, like, the Ruby developer, go to this repo and clone it. Docker compose up, and you should have everything working. I think that might help with some of the adoption.
Yeah.
And again, and that way people can really kind of think about OpenTelemetry and the spec and the API and the tools, and not have to sit there and go, like, banging your head against Docker networking and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I think can help with that somewhat is I don't know if you've had a chance to play around with the OpenTelemetry demo app.
I have not.
So it's actually a cool little demo that shows all the things that OpenTelemetry can do, and I think it's based on like the Hipster Shop app, and it's been OTelified.
Okay.
It
Wow.
basically demonstrates like all the cool stuff that you can do with OpenTelemetry in different languages. So like different microservices written in different languages. There's a Docker Compose, so you can get it up and running nice and fast. And then there's also there's a Helm chart for deploying it in Kubernetes if you are so inclined.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
definitely a cool one to point folks at Uplight to for the extra wow factor of like, look at the cool stuff that can happen.
Yeah.
I just
Feel
put the
bad. I didn't
link
know about
in
it.
the chat.
Yeah, I saw that, Reese. Thank you for sharing it. I'm just glancing at the repo now. I don't believe I've seen this before, and I feel a little naive.
It came out
I
just
mean,
last summer, so it's like it's relatively new. There's a channel also for the demo app if you want to peek in to see like
Okay, cool.
how it's being updated.
Yeah.
And then there's also you talked about like central libraries for configuring OpenTelemetry. There is some work. There's a channel called OTel config file, which I mean, it doesn't take the place of a centralized library, but it does aim to make it a little bit easier to configure your OpenTelemetry SDKs to make it less of a challenge.
Okay, good.
Depending on the language, it's like okay, but certain languages are more difficult. So that's another good channel to check out.
Yeah.
That one's also pretty new. It's a fairly new initiative.
So one of the things, and I think Adriana, you and I might have talked about this, but I'm working on I'm trying to create like the most minimal example of two Python services talking to each other and leveraging context propagation so that you can see that distributed tracing. And so I'm trying to do something that really should allow anybody with, a modern operating system in Docker, let's say, to clone a repo, Docker compose up, hit a service, and then see the two services talking to each other and surfacing that stuff with Jaeger, so that people can download something and just really kind of focus on the core concepts of context propagation and how that helps enable distributed tracing, and just trying to push everything away. Like the most minimal Python fast API services talking to each other, but doing something really powerful. And in a way that like there's very, very minimal infrastructure that you're going to need to run it. Like if you have a modern operating system in Docker, you can clone this repo, and within a few moments you can run a command and be like, ooh, now I see what's happening. This thing created a trace. That trace lived over there. And I can see how these two processes are communicating with each other across those process boundaries.
Yeah. Because I mean, I want to say that there's like kind of some stuff around that
I'm sure.
in the Python repo. Like if I recall correctly, there should be an example of like two services talking to each other to show that context propagation. I don't recall if it's like super duper simple to set up.
For me, and I think for a lot of other developers, well, I should say, I'm a developer that is a tactile learner. And so like I like to read a little bit, but then I like to look at code a lot of it. And so for me, the best way to learn something like this would be to skinny it down. Hopefully this is in the demo app, this concept of distributed tracing and context propagation. But I also find, at least for me personally, in the way that I like to learn, that if I can abstract away all of the other stuff and just focus on that one thing, and I can touch it, then I can learn it really fast.
Yeah, definitely agree with you. I'm that kind of learner too.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's really great feedback. Well, I know we are at time. So thank you everyone for joining. Doug, in case anyone wants to keep the conversation going, we can always take the conversation to our Slack channel. We can, Reese, Rin, which of the channels do you think we can continue the conversation in, if anyone has any questions for Doug, or if we want to have any
Probably
questions.
OTel user research.
All right, cool.
Yeah, that's the public one. We do have a private one called OTel End Users that Reese and I are happy to add people to. I think we might make that channel public in the near future, but for right now, just go to OTel User Research.
All right, cool. Awesome.
Yep, and I'm in that Slack org, so I can be DM'd directly if needed.
Awesome. Awesome.
And you know, like I said, I love observability. You know, I still get excited when I see my code running, and I've been doing this for a long time. But I still get excited about it. It's awesome.
I share your enthusiasm. I'm glad you're still stoked about observability. Oh,
Yeah,
and
for
before
sure.
we wrap up, Doug, you're doing an OTel in practice session at the end of the month. So everyone,
Yes.
keep your eyes peeled for announcements around that with details. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that that will be largely based on this this little reference architecture that I'm building around context propagation and distributed tracing. So
Cool.
I'm looking forward to that very much.
Awesome. And also we will be, you're okay with us posting the recording for this?
Sure.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And we will also be doing a blog post summary for folks who prefer to read rather than watch. So you have many ways to
There are those people. They're out there.
I'm one of them.
I'm a reader. I'm a reader.
Me? Wow.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you all for letting me
us.
give me the opportunity to talk about this. I love nerding out on stuff like this.
Cool. Well, thanks again, and everyone have an awesome day.
Yes, thank you so much. It was great to meet you.
Yep. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.